So now we will have our 6 spotlight talks, and we have an amazing list of talks prepared, so please stay to listen to them. So just to go over the format, each speaker will speak for 5 minutes, followed by 1 question from the audience or myself. And audience members, feel free to ask questions using Slido or Zoom. And during this question time, if the current speaker could unshare their screen while the next speaker shares theirs, that would also be great. So I'm just going to go in the order of speakers that we have listed on the website. So just really quickly, it is going to be David, Andy, Woody, Kalisha, Cameron, and Hajia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Awesome, yeah, so feel free to get started, David.
Mute. Sorry for that. All right. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is David Abink, and this is a shared talk also with Nick Beckers and Timo Melman. And so one of the first things we want to talk about is what's emergent behavior. And so we view it as occurring from the dynamic interaction between different organisms in an environment. And so typical examples usually include these kind of swarm type of behavior, schools of fish. But we also see it in, for example, in traffic environments to explain, for example, traffic jams. But so the most important thing, I think, is that it cannot be inferred from observing the isolated behavior of an individual organism or entity in that environment. And so that's not even true for humans with all their theory of mind. It's even true for sheep. That have very simple reward functions. All they want to do is run away from harm and follow the sheep in front of them. And so with 1 sheep and a car, there's no problem. But if you have a couple of sheep and a vehicle, then you might get these kind of sheep tornadoes. Right, so that's, I guess, an example of emergent interaction that maybe you can't see coming. But so typically we focus not on many agents, but just 2. A driver and an algorithm both interacting in what we call a semi-automated vehicle in an environment. And then so what we just talked about already in the panel session, there's actually might be mismatches in the reward functions. You can try to model people as behaving as rational agents with all kinds of techniques, but you're probably not going to be right all the time. And so all sorts of behaviors might emerge that are hard to predict and perhaps even undesirable. They might be in the algorithm interacting in its own, might be in the driver realizing that there's automation adapting his or her behavior, for example, falling asleep or being panicked. And there might even be interaction between the adaptive driver and the adaptive automation. And so what we typically do in our lab is we follow a 3-pronged approach, where we want to mitigate misalignments by really accurate models of individual driver behavior and that generalize well. But secondly, we also want to mitigate misalignments by making models of driver behavioral adaptation when they interact with automation. So this is a second kind of emergent behavior. And finally, we really focus on the interaction design so that drivers can actually cope with misalignments and emergent behaviors for all the stuff that we didn't manage. So we'll give you 3 examples from our lab, and the first will be given by Nick. Yes. There you go.
Yes, so an important source of misalignment between a driver and an automated vehicle is the trajectory that the vehicle plans and follows. For example, like a common strategy is to just follow the center of the lane. However, we prefer to steer away from parked cars, for example, resulting in conflicts between the driver and the vehicle. And to mitigate these misalignments as good as possible, we need to understand the underlying mechanisms of the driver's preferences and use these in the car's planning algorithms. So in our lab, we started at a long-standing theory in human factors on how drivers perceive risk. In short, this theory proposes that drivers consider the consequences of an event occurring in the driving scene, and that driver have a belief of this probability of an event actually occurring. And combining these 2, we have a perceived subjective risk. And we captured this theory into a computational model, which models the driver's belief at a driver risk field. This is the little representation of it. And combined with the assigned weight to an event consequence, if it were to happen, this model calculates a quantified perceived risk. So we actually implement this model and it results into human-like driver behavior that emerges from risk-based driving model across several driving scenarios and also styles. But like they've already said, no matter how good the model is, it will never be perfect. And this model does not describe interaction behavior with automation yet, but only driving behavior in isolation.
Yes, and secondly, it's important to understand that actually the interaction itself changes the behavior of the driver, often in ways undesired in terms of safety. And for example, suppose you're driving on a curvy road, as you can see here on the top, where you see the curvature, and on the bottom is the corresponding speed profile, where you can see that people decelerate in front of curves and accelerate when they are driving on straight lanes. And what we found is that when drivers are interacting with a haptic lane keeping assistance, they actually misuse part of the lane keeping benefits to increase their speed, and that's dangerous. And this is so-called the emergent behavioral adaptation. And there are many theories that explain this emergent behavioral adaptations in hindsight. And what we did, we used these theories and incorporate them in the haptic lane keeping assistance such that we actually prevent, or we hypothesized that it would prevent these speeding. And we tested it on the same subset of drivers. And what we found was that, that indeed there was no speeding effect. But more importantly, we kept the full benefits, safety benefits, and especially this shows that it's that you really need to think about the joint system instead of only the algorithm itself.
And so finally, the third point where we work on is that this interaction design really matters. And so the example that Timo gave is based on shared control. Which is different than trading control back and forth, either the driver or the automation. And here they continuously communicate, and that allows actually people to remain engaged and be aware of conflicts and deal with them appropriately, and also for the system to learn that that there are maybe conflicts. And so it really allows this kind of mutual interaction. And so through that interaction, actually, you might say that everything that we didn't manage to model can actually be solved by the driver. And so this was, of course, a very specific case. And so we're very interested in discussions with you how these kind of principles of mitigating as much as possible and making sure that that drivers can actually, or humans can actually, deal with any kind of conflicts in a nice way. How that might translate to different kind of domains. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the talk. There any questions? If not, while David, if you can share your screen, and Andy, if you could start sharing yours, I have a question for you guys. So I was hoping if you could talk a little bit more about the driver-centered design. So for instance, should the driver always be able to take over control, or are there any ways that the car can learn from corrections that the human gives in the driver-centered control in an online manner?
Right, great question. And so yes, you can actually learn online within boundaries from driver preferences, for example. I always say that conflicts are fine as long as they're not repetitive, but actually conflicts might actually make you aware, and they might actually teach you something. And so within boundaries, and that's hard to, that's kind of a research challenge, I think we can adapt in real time to these kind of preferences. And so if you keep it connected and allow drivers to overrule, basically I always do that because I kind of have an innate distrust towards engineers because I'm one myself. So I always think that we should allow humans to be aware of the actions, understand what the system can do, cannot do, and allow to overrule. Yeah.
Thank you. Andy, feel free to start whenever you're ready. You might be muted.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Awesome. So hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. So I'm a PhD student at Stanford, and I'll be presenting our work on conventions and adaptive human-AI collaboration. And this is joint work with Arjun and Dorsa. So in many collaborative tasks, there can be many equally optimal strategies. So for example, in team sports, such as playing basketball, teammates can have equally optimal ways of signaling to each other when they want to pass the ball. So often what matters is not the exact specific strategy they agree on, it's just that they agree to coordinate on some optimal strategy. So we'll kind of refer to this concept as conventions, which we define as a shared representation that develops over repeated interactions and used for breaking symmetry between equally optimal strategies. So to provide sort of a concrete example, we developed a block placing task, which is a two-player turn-based task. So basically 2 players take turns placing grids of blocks of one color onto some grid, and they want to try and reconstruct this goal grid. But there's only partial visibility. So for example, the blue player can't really see what the goal grid looks like. So they'll take turns building the grid. And since the blue player cannot see what the goal grid looks like, she has to rely on interpreting the red player's actions. And there are multiple different ways you could possibly interpret the red player's actions. So this relies on them developing a convention over time to solve the task. So you may be wondering, well, do conventions really matter and when do they matter? Because you could imagine for a game such as 4-player chess where 2 players are coordinating trying to play one side of the board, that conventions probably don't matter very much because you could have strong players that could coordinate near optimally without very much prior interaction. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you could imagine friendly rock, paper, scissors, where, for example, the task is to always throw the same hand, so you always get a draw. And in this task, conventions probably matter a lot more because without prior interactions, there's only a 1/3 chance of getting things right. So to sort of quantify this more precisely, we're proposing the following measure of convention dependency, which you can think of as sampling partners from some distribution P of F, which is the distribution induced by some learning algorithm F over pairs of partners. And you look at the reward of partners who are trained together, and you subtract from that the expected reward of partners who are trained separately, and you sort of force them to play together. So you can think of this as the regret of not playing with the partner you were trained with, but with some randomly sampled partner from the learning algorithm. And we can sort of ask ourselves, where does this block placing task lie on this spectrum? So we varied a few different settings of the game. For example, we lowered the visibility so that the blue player sees less or more, or we changed the rules so that the goal grid is more constrained or less constrained. And we saw that with less visibility and with fewer constraints, we observed a higher convention dependence, which sort of aligns with our intuition because in these settings, there are more equally optimal ways to coordinate. So sort of the convention with which you break symmetries becomes more important. So now that we've established which tasks are more dependent on conventions, how can we adapt to new conventions? So the key insight we had is that a task can involve intrinsic rule complexities that are sort of skills that don't really depend on which partner you're playing with, and it can depend on partner-specific conventions. So we'll denote this rule representation as V and convention representation as Z. So how we learn this representation is we parameterize our policy network with a shared representation for the rule complexities, and we have a partner-specific representation for the conventions. So we do a sort of round-robin style training where our AI agent takes turns playing with different partners. And at each time we use the shared rule representation and then we train specific conventions for each partner. At test time, when we get a new partner, we can fix this rule representation and only try to learn the partner-specific conventions. And through this method, we were able to observe better adaptation to new partners. Finally, we try to look at which conventions are more human-friendly. So we studied a bunch of different styles of conventions that we designed, also some that were emergent through self-play. And we saw that humans were better at adapting to more explainable conventions. There are a lot of different settings, but since I'm short on time, I'll just say that they had trouble adapting to conventions that emerged directly from self-play. So perhaps this is limitation on how much we can rely on humans to adapt to robots instead of the other way around. So in summary, we basically looked at this measure of convention dependence to see how much a task relies on conventions. And we learned to separate rule from convention representations for better adaptation to new partners. And we saw that humans adapt better to more explainable conventions.
Thanks for the awesome talk, Andy. Just as a reminder for audience members, feel free to ask questions through Zoom or Slido. Andy, I have a question for you. So I'm curious how this work relates to meta-learning. So for instance, if I have a meta-learned agent that is able to play well with other agents in a zero-shot way, does this mean that the game doesn't rely much on conventions?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So yeah, it does relate pretty well, because you could imagine this also relates somewhat to multitask learning, because you could imagine, adapting to new partners as adapting to new tasks, basically. I would say that I guess our method is not zero shot, because when we're adapting to new partners, we're fixing the rule representation, but we're still trying to adapt to the convention representation.
So I had a follow-up question here.
Yeah.
You measured this difference between partners trained together and partners trained separately.
Yes.
But I mean, how you train partners will crucially change that equation, right? So, I mean, we have a paper on how you should train partners when you're optimizing for coordination or zero-shot coordination. And obviously self-play is the wrong thing to do. So if you're measuring against self-play, I think that's just the wrong metric to some extent. Your equation depends crucially on the algorithm being used to optimize the agents.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a very good point. So the way we sort of define this dependence, also takes as input whatever learning algorithm you're providing. And yes, so it would depend heavily on that. So for example, I guess in your 30-minute talk, there was this method on other play. I guess if you're able to use that method, you would observe a very different metric for this.
Thank you.
Okay, Woody, feel free to get started whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Hold on. Okay, cool. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Hey everyone, my name is Woody Wang. Today I'll explain a method for encouraging pro-social behavior in environments with multiple selfish learning agents. So specifically, we're trying to learn correlated equilibrium using a synchronized exploration method. So reinforcement learning methods have become really successful recently in training agents to solve human relevant tasks. Specifically, deep Q networks and policy gradient methods have shown enormous success in single agent environments. However, multi-agent environments are still a challenge. So when multiple learning agents are present, the environment becomes non-stationary for each agent, and learning when to cooperate versus compete can be difficult. So we take a look at multi-agent RL from a game theoretic standpoint. We want to maximize the social welfare while still having selfish agents. So to illustrate these concepts, we'll examine the iterated game of chicken. In the game of chicken, each agent can either chicken or dare, and the game has two agents that are in collision course, and neither wants to be the one that swerves and chicken out. But if both dare, they will crash, which is undesirable. Each turn, the row and column players simultaneously select their actions and receive rewards according to the payoff matrix shown. And one solution concept is the pure Nash equilibrium, in which each agent has no incentive to deviate from the strategy given the strategy of their opponent. So there are two pure Nash equilibria. One of them is such that the first agent always chickens and the second always dares. And the second is such that the first agent always dares and the second always chickens. So these are the two pure Nash equilibria. And although these are good predictors of rational behavior, there exists a more general notion of equilibrium that still maintains rationality and allows for better social outcomes, namely correlated equilibria, which is a superset of the pure Nash. Correlated equilibria is any randomized action recommendations that no party wants to deviate from. So the correlated equilibrium is pro-social, as it can achieve a larger expected sum of agents reward compared to the pure Nash equilibrium. So here's an example of one such correlated equilibrium in the chicken setting. So we consider an oracle that at each turn sends each agent a signal that encodes the recommendation. Each agent only observes their own signal, but the oracle correlates the two signals. So one example of a correlated equilibrium is when the oracle draws one of three pairs of recommendations and gives them to the agents. So with probability 0.5, the oracle recommends both agents to chicken. with probability 0.25, the oracle recommends dare chicken. And with the final probability of 0.25, the oracle recommends chicken dare. And under the action recommendations of the oracle, no selfish agent would choose to deviate. So the pure Nash equilibria are easier to learn as they only require one agent to selfishly always choose dare, and the other agent's best option is just to chicken all the time, assuming the daring agent won't change their strategy. But correlated equilibria are harder to learn as the agents must both accept the action recommendations of the oracle. And suppose the agents are in pure Nash, as in the matrix shown. By definition of pure Nash equilibria, neither agent has incentive to deviate, so individual exploration would not be as effective in changing either agent's strategy. However, if agents explore together and try exploratory actions at the same time, there's higher chance they might perform actions necessary to reach correlated equilibrium. So synchronizing exploration of agents increases the probability of performing actions that lead to correlated equilibria. So I'll describe our method. As a quick refresher, here's regular epsilon greedy exploration, where each agent independently explores. Each agent independently with probability epsilon selects a random action, and with probability 1 minus epsilon chooses its current best action. And here's our method of synchronized epsilon greedy exploration, where both agents explore or act greedily based on a shared epsilon parameter. So this method encourages exploring correlated equilibrium actions together and allows agents to retain self-interest in the long run. And unlike previous methods, such as correlated Q-learning, agents don't need to share the details of their policies with each other. And also our method can be applied to any algorithm that allows off-policy exploration. So we test our method by using synchronized exploration with DQN, and we compare our method to various baselines. And from this graph, you can see average reward is on the y-axis. So as one baseline, we use MAD DPG, which encourages cooperation via centralized training, but we can see here that it reaches pure Nash equilibrium. We also try reinforce, which also reaches pure Nash. And we tried vanilla DQN with independent epsilon greedy exploration, and that reaches pure Nash. But our algorithm reaches correlated equilibrium as we want. And so we found that random initialization has a large effect on how often each method reaches correlated equilibrium. So we use 100 different runs for both DQN methods with varying initializations, but the same hyperparameters. And we can see that synchronized epsilon greedy results in correlated equilibrium for more runs with varying initializations. But independent epsilon greedy has more runs that start out in correlated equilibrium, but very few that end up staying in correlated equilibrium after training for a while. And so our work is still very much a work in progress. We're working on evaluating our method on more general stochastic games. And we've already designed our own new game called Grandma's Cookies as an extension of the iterated game of chicken. We're also investigating a frozen exploration approach where the agents take turns making optimization steps and exploring. And the idea behind this is if the frozen agent can fix an exploratory strategy, then the learning agent can hill climb and learn the best current strategy with less stochasticity from the environment. And finally, we're considering methods to explicitly condition the policies on the signal, as preliminary results show it's pretty difficult to force the agents to consider the signal. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for the talk, Woody. So we have one question from Slido, actually. This person is asking, how will the agents know that they should both explore? Is there some mutual signal?
Yeah, so the way we're doing this is basically like at the beginning of training, the synchronized exploration has a shared epsilon. So it's just like they both have to explore at the same time or act greedily at the same time. And then that epsilon is annealed and decays to where they can act selfish in the long run. But like at the beginning, they coordinate in their exploration.
Sounds good. Next speaker we have is Kalisha. So if you could share your screen and
yes. Okay, can you see that just fine?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kalisha Bullard. I am a postdoc at Facebook AI Research, and today I'm going to talk to you about some work that I'm leading on learning nonverbal communication for populations of embodied agents. And this is joint work with Jacob and some other researchers at FAIR and Mila. So my overarching research interests really lie in learning and decision-making from multi-agent contexts. And above you see 3 examples of different multi-agent contexts. I claim that in a large majority of multi-agent contexts, each agent can benefit from the ability to communicate effectively with other agents. So this talk is going to really focus on multi-agent communication for embodied agents. There's been a large body of work on learning multi-agent communication, primarily in the AI and machine learning space. And this is just a sample of recent related prior work. But the key thing that I want to highlight here is that a key limitation of the work for, as it pertains to embodied agents, is that most prior work focuses on symbolic or discrete communication channels. So embodied agents, however, have this additional modality for communication. Embodied agents, like the ones you see in these application domains, robots and virtual characters, they have the ability to communicate through motion, like humans have the ability to communicate through gesture and motion, physical actions. Now, I will give the caveat that this work is not going to be appropriate for realistic embodied communications, but it begins to explore this question through simulated agent-agent interaction. So the problem of communication protocol learning. Let's say you have a population of agents and you have some library of concepts. In this case, they represent communicative intents or goals. The protocol learning problem is to learn a mapping such that for all agents in the community, each agent learns a policy that maps the set of communicative intents to messages for generating that communication. So the visual that you see here is each agent learning a policy that can generate messages for each intent. Referential games have been commonly employed in the literature for protocol learning. So the referential game goes as follows. You have a sender agent, Alice, that gets a goal or intent, G. She generates a message that Bob, the receiver, will observe. Bob will make a prediction about what intent was being communicated, and then the loss is the distance between the target and the predicted intent. And it's a referential game because the goal is for the receiver to infer what the sender was referring to. So we use the reinforcement learning framework for this, a standard RL framework where the agent takes in state information, generates actions at each time step, and the goal is to maximize cumulative discounted reward. So taken all together, the training regime for protocol learning is you have at each turn in the game or each iteration of a game, you have a sender and a receiver agent. The sender agent is training a policy. The receiver agent is in parallel training a discriminator network. The sender agent, the policy takes in the current state and goal at the time step and produces an action. It'll do this over a sequence of time steps. And so the message is the sequence of states traversed. The discriminator receiver will take in the message and produce a predicted intent. And then the shared return is back propagated as feedback to the sender. So our experimental design, we looked at two different agent embodiments here. The state space was 6 degrees of freedom for each joint on the agent embodiment. So X, Y, Z, and roll pitch yaw for each joint. The action space for angular joint velocity, so change in angular rotation. Our messages here consist of motion trajectories, and we used a fixed time frame trajectory length. And so here, what I mainly want to show you is just the training learning curves. These are preliminary results that I'm showing. On a robot arm agent population using self-play, it's averaged across 5 random seeds, and we did exploration with Gaussian noise. We had 2 different conditions that we tested, which I'm not going to go into detail about, but the key thing that I want to show here is that in both conditions, regardless of the distribution over communicative intents, we saw that we are able to successfully train a communication protocol using this nonverbal modality. And so here are a couple qualitative results. So these are 2 example trajectories for the robot arm, 2 example, these are for 2 different communicative intents for the humanoid. So the main thing I want you to take from this is that although we successfully train communication protocols, there are still open questions about how do we shape the behavior in a meaningful way. So in terms of ongoing work, we're currently investigating generalization properties of the learned communication protocols. So we're looking at zero-shot communication and using energy cost regularization. Towards this end of emergence, like what we talked about earlier, we don't want to just look at self-play, we want to look at cross-play, where each agent trains with every other agent receiver in the community. And then for future directions, I'm really interested in protocol learning with constraints. So how do we learn maybe a more natural protocol, particularly if you were to put the robot agents in a community with humans? or in an environment with humans? And how does exploration policy actually affect the protocol learning process? Thanks.
Awesome, thank you. I have a question. So I'm wondering if it is possible for there to be multiple or even infinite types of motion that exert the same amount of energy. And I think this might also be part of your future work. So I'm kind of curious, if so, how can you guarantee zero-shot coordination with independently trained partners so they converge on the same gestural convention, basically?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So a key part of the approach that we're looking at is, there's two aspects. One aspect is looking at having some penalty with respect to energy costs, but like you said, there are infinite trajectories that could have the same energy. The other aspect is the non-uniform distribution that I talked about. So putting some kind of structure in terms of how do you assign meaning to the trajectories? So you want each of the agents to label trajectories in the same way. And the idea is the most costly trajectory, or the least costly trajectory, should be assigned to the intents that occur the most frequently in the distribution. And then hopefully, if they're assigning meaning in similar ways and they're all generating more energy efficient trajectories, you should see some zero-shot communication.
Awesome. I think Robert has also raised his hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, yeah, this is really cool. I was sort of thinking of other modality differences between the sort of kind of traditional discrete channel modality and this like higher dimensional gestural channel. And it seems like another interesting thing is like the continuous space of trajectories. There's sort of more of a discriminability issue in principle, where it's sort of like the distance apart from two trajectories can lead to confusability. So it's sort of like there's more of a, like if you're having to perceive a trajectory and there's like noise on the perception of a trajectory, it seems like there may be an incentive to sort of code intended messages into like maximally distinguishable parts of the space or something interesting like that. And I wondered if you'd explored those kinds of objectives.
Yeah, that's another great question. So, I mean, that is actually one of the key things that I didn't actually put that, but that's one of the key things I'm wanting to explore next, something that Jacob and I have been talking about, because I'm really interested, I mean, particularly because it's a very visual thing, you need different intents to be visually distinct. And so I'm really interested in, the reason why I'm interested in exploration policy is actually to try to induce more diversity across intents in the protocol for this very purpose.
It's really great, thanks.
Thank you, thanks for the questions.
Awesome. So Cameron, feel free to take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. Everybody can see this all right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Hi, my name's Cameron. I'm a PhD student at UC San Diego, and today I'll be talking about coordinating on shared procedural abstractions for physical assembly. So in many real-world settings, human and robot teams are expected to collaborate not just once, but many times. And however, even the most advanced robots today typically are specialized to perform specific acts over and over again, rather than flexibly adapt their behavior to their human collaborators. So by contrast, human team members have an amazing ability to adapt to one another over time by developing shared conventions that lead to more efficient communication. In particular, they develop what are called communicative conventions, which are expressed in natural language and govern which words to use to describe familiar entities and actions. For example, suppose you are trying to assemble a bunch of dreaded IKEA dining room chairs in your new home, and your neighbor, who's very kind, is helping walk you through the instruction manual, but unfortunately, because it's quarantine, they have to do it over Zoom. For that first chair, they might describe in painstaking detail what every single little piece looks like and how to attach them. But by the time you get to that last chair, hopefully you've come up with some sort of shorthand to refer to whole sequences of actions, like use the medium screws to attach all of the legs and then put the back on, or something like that. And our project aims to import some of these insights from cognitive science into task domains like physical assembly and transport that are especially relevant for thinking about human-robot collaboration. And today I'm going to tell you about some of our preliminary findings using a virtual collaborative assembly task with human participants. And our goal is that having a detailed understanding of how human teams use language to collaborate will both inspire the development of robots that adapt to their collaborators in a more human-like way, and as well as serving as like a sort of benchmark for human-robot interactions. So I'm going to walk you through sort of a high-level overview, and then we'll look at the experiment itself. The goal of the human teams in our experiment was to reconstruct a scene containing block towers. These scenes were compositionally structured, with each scene containing 2 basic towers and each tower containing 4 blocks. Our participants were paired up in an online experiment, this interface here, and assigned either the role of architect or builder. On each trial, the architect viewed a scene but was unable to place blocks themselves, and the builder was given a fixed inventory of blocks but couldn't see the target scene. So here I'm going to give you a little demo. The goal of the architect was to give instructions in natural language to the builder using this chat box. And the builder's goal was to reconstruct the target scene as accurately as possible. The architect could see where blocks were placed and then give new instructions, and the partners took turns until all 8 blocks were placed, and then we shower them with confetti if they do well. Each scene was presented 4 times and interleaved among other scenes, which allows us to examine the behavioral signatures of the emergence of shared procedural abstractions across repeated collaborations. So to get an idea of what I mean by like procedural abstractions and conventions, here are some examples of the instructions that architects used to send to their partners. On the first trial, architects tended to provide fairly similar instructions referring to blocks individually. So for example, things like place a horizontal block on square 11, or something like that. Looking at this first pair, by the middle of this interaction, this architect began referring to structures simply by their shape. In the middle, they're calling them house-like structures. And then by the end, they had developed a concise label for each, like the L-shape tower. What's really interesting is, as you can see here, each pair developed qualitatively very different kinds of shorthand by the end of the experiment. And since each set of towers was shown 4 times, we can measure how different behaviors emerge across repetitions of the same tower. So on the x-axis, we'll be showing repetitions of towers. And first, we find that architects increasingly use fewer words across repetitions, making communication much more efficient. These gray lines are each of the pairs in our pilot, and the red line is the average across all of them. So fewer words per trial. We also find that despite receiving increasingly sparse instructions, builders place more blocks per message across repeated trials. And finally, despite shorter messages and placing more blocks per message, teams were able to increasingly improve their score and reach near ceiling performance in the later trials. In summary, we developed an empirical approach to examine how humans form conventions in procedural tasks. In ongoing work, we're analyzing how this language evolves over time, and we are hoping to better understand how people decide what to say and when, and what information is necessary and sufficient at different times. And in the future, we believe that these data sets can serve as a benchmark to guide the development of learning algorithms in either either architect or builder roles. And just special thanks to my collaborators in the CogTools lab at UCSD.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I guess trying to scan for raised hands right now. Hey, thanks for the awesome talk. I can go ahead and ask a question. So I thought this block building task was super interesting because I feel like the notion of compositionality is very explicit. Like you explicitly reuse components to build more complex components and stuff. So I'm kind of curious if in your analyses, if you found like whether people commonly took advantage of this compositionality as they reduced their instructions, basically.
Yeah, so super great question. So we did find, so if you think the 3 levels of compositionality might be blocks go into towers, towers go into scenes, we do find definitely that people develop these conventions to refer to the groups of blocks as a single tower, and even at the end, groups of towers as a single scene in one message. What would be really interesting going forward is developing more complex compositional structures where either you have some sort of fractal or some sort of small sub-piece that could be used in a larger tower. In this one, there's not a great way to group sets of blocks that aren't the complete tower So making more complex structures would be a great way to test sort of further compositionality.
Cool, thanks.
No worries.
I think there is a question from our audience, Reuben.
Yeah, sorry if this repeated the last question a little bit, but yeah, I was curious what sort of abstractions people were building as they were, sort of, if you were reading the text that people actually created, were they that sort of abstraction that you just talked about, or were they sort of additional things that were unexpected? And also how between dyads?
Yeah, so great question. So we found, so again, just qualitatively from what I can remember, and we're still parsing out some of this, a lot of people did go with a like a shape set for the tower, so a referential shape like the L shape or the tall tower or something like that. We did find a few people that did abstractions in like a super concise manner. So they basically cut out all the like they would like V2 or something would be a vertical block on square 2 or something like that. And those were interesting conventions that we hadn't anticipated, but largely there was a few different phrases, but mostly people would go to the tower scene as their or the tower level for their abstractions.
Cool. Thanks so much. And we have our last talk of the workshop right now. Hojia, is that how you pronounce? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yes,
so
correct.
we can see your screen, so feel free to start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Hejia Zhang and I'm from USC. Today I'm going to present my work on robot learning from YouTube cooking videos. In this work, we specifically focus on cooking domain because it has various collaborative actions. We wish to enable robots to be able to learn manipulation tasks autonomously. And there are tons of videos of how humans perform different manipulation tasks together. So we propose this research question: how can the robot learn and execute collaborative manipulation plans from online videos? Our key insight is that we can extract related objects and information about performed actions from videos by detecting and tracking hands. So based on this key insight, we propose this highly modular video system. The input to our system is an unconstrained YouTube video. And we have several subsystems for extracting related information from YouTube videos. And I will introduce these subsystems in the following slides. We first use deep learning techniques to detect hands and objects. And then we will segment the video to be several action clips based on the hand trajectories of humans. In this example, in the first clip, the woman is holding the plate for the girl, and in the next clip, the woman places the plate down. Then we want to infer what the actions are being performed in the video. So we do it by associating hands with objects. Since we already detected all the hands and objects in the video, then we will associate hands with objects based on their relative distances. So in this example, we will associate knife, meat, and cutting board with the right hand of the girl. Once we know which objects are being related to the action, we will want to infer what the actions are being performed in the video. So in this example, we will do it by exploiting the natural language corpus. And in this example, we will say the cutting is the most likely actions if the related objects are knife, chicken, and cutting board. We also want to detect collaborative actions from videos. So we do it by detecting if two humans are grasping or manipulating the same object. So in this example, the woman is grasping the cutting board and the girl is manipulating on the cutting board. So we say there is a collaboration. And we want to know if the collaboration is holding or hand over. And we do it by detecting if the ownership of the object has changed in the action. In this example, the ownership of the cutting board didn't change. So we say it's a holding. And in the next example, the ownership of the lemon changed. So we say it's a handover. Then we want to represent these actions in a general form, and we do it by using a theory of language for actions, and we will represent these actions as grammar trees. So this is an example tree, and this is another example tree. Once we extracted all these actions from videos, we will construct an action graph by merging all these extracted actions. And we implemented this in an open source platform called WeCook. So this is an example of executing the action graph in the simulation environment. With the same platform, we can also execute the action graph in the real world by a human and a robot team. So we found this is an exciting work towards robots autonomously learn and execute collaborative manipulation tasks by watching YouTube videos. And there are several future directions that can be pursued. So for example, we want to study if the robot can learn how to predict when a collaborative action is about to happen by watching YouTube videos, and how collaborative actions emerge in the close proximity interactions, and why each collaborative action happens. So to sum up, in this work, we propose a system for robots to learn and execute collaborative manipulation tasks by watching YouTube videos. And this concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Hejia. If there are any questions, feel free to speak up now. Otherwise, I can quickly ask one. Okay, maybe I can quickly ask one then.
There's a question from audience again. Ifrah, is a question?
Guys? No.
Hi, we can hear you. Hello. We can't hear you right now. Oh, it looks like you're muted.
Yeah, maybe you can write your question and we can read it loud.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Okay. Maybe I can go ahead and ask a question, and then when Ifrah asks or writes her question, we can ask that one afterward. So one question I had was, I was wondering if you could give us a bit more detail on how you ground the human interpretable action plans to the robot trajectories.
The robot trajectories. Do you mean how we execute the actions?
Yeah, from like the action plans, how you turn them into trajectories. Basically, is it like kind of like a hand-coded library of primitives? Or...
Right. So we assume we have a skill library where we define the task space regions for all the different actions. For example, stirring and carting, and then we will use some motion planning algorithms to plan the trajectory.
Thank you.
Does this answer your question?